The sun blazed over the savannah, dyeing the horizon golden and orange. The hot wind carried the scent of dry earth, mingled with the trail of blood that still clung to the ground after a recent hunt. The silence was heavy, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the distant sound of vultures circling above a carcass. In the center of that arid expanse, a hungry lioness walked slowly, the bones marking the outline of her weakened body. Her eyes, once full of strength, now reflected only exhaustion and despair. For days, she had not found enough food for herself or the cubs that waited for her hidden among the dry bushes. Fate, however, was preparing an unthinkable scenario. As she followed the scent of fresh meat, the lioness noticed something strange in the air. The scent was human, strong, mixed with sweat and fear. She stopped, raised her head and sniffed the wind. A metallic sound cut through the silence. The snap of a taut rope, the sound of a net swinging. Instinct led her to a clearing surrounded by low bushes. There, in the shadow of a twisted tree, a hunter was trapped in his own trap, suspended a few feet above the ground, completely vulnerable. The man struggled in vain against the ropes, trying to free himself from the entanglement that held him suspended. His sweat-covered face betrayed the panic that gripped him. The ground beneath him was marked by lion footprints, large, deep, fresh. He had become what he so feared, prey. The smell of blood from his open wounds drew every invisible gaze across the savannah. And among those gazes, the most penetrating was that of the lioness who now watched him, motionless amid the tall grasses. She approached unhurriedly, each step measured, her muscles tense, her gaze fixed. The wind blew in her favor, bringing to her the scent of human fear, mixed with dust and the iron of blood. The hunter's heart pounded, and the net swayed with each desperate movement. The contrast was brutal. The hungry predator facing a defenseless man, the hunter who had lost control of his own trap. The scene unfolded with an almost symbolic power, the natural balance inverted before the eyes of nature itself. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The lioness advanced, her body poised for attack, her claws ripping at the dry sand. The air was filled with pure tension, so much so that time seemed suspended. The man closed his eyes, resigned to what he thought was the end. But the expected roar never came. The sound that echoed was different, a deep sigh, the hot breath of the beast approaching the trapped body, the light touch of its muzzle on the torn fabric. She sniffed him, circled, and retreated. The look she gave him wasn't just hunger. There was curiosity, doubt, something that went beyond simple hunting instinct. A camera belonging to a group of researchers monitoring the area after detecting unusual movements captured the exact moment. The transmitted image showed the impossible. A hungry lioness finds a hunter trapped in a net, and her reaction surprises everyone. The animal, instead of attacking, slowly backed away and lay down a few meters away, as if guarding the man who had previously destroyed her species. The scene was one of reverent silence. Nature seemed to witness a role reversal that defied any logical explanation. The hunter, paralyzed between fear and bewilderment, observed the imposing presence surrounding him with no intention of killing. The lioness, for her part, seemed to be waging an internal battle between the hunger that consumed her and something deeper, perhaps the recognition of shared suffering. Time passed slowly, measured by the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of thunder announcing rain. The scent of the man now mingled with that of the wet earth, which was beginning to fall in spaced drops. The hammock, once a symbol of human power, ironically became an altar of vulnerability. And before him, the lioness remained silent, watching, breathing, feeling. From afar, the researchers approached cautiously, unable to believe what they saw through their lenses. The rain intensified, washing away the dried blood from the ground and dissolving the marks of the violence that had occurred there. The animal gave the man one last look, then rose, walked toward the forest, and disappeared into the golden afternoon mist. The man remained motionless, soaked, unable to comprehend why he was still alive. The camera continued recording, and the record of that encounter would become one of the most shared images in the world in the hours that followed. A story about the boundary between instinct and compassion, about the moment when the most feared predator chose not to kill. And then, as the screen fades to black, the narrative launches the journey's central thread. But how did we get to this point? The question echoes in the sound of the rain and the beating of the trapped man's heart, marking the beginning of a story where nature demands, teaches, and sometimes forgives. The savannah returns to silence. Only the distant sound of roars indicates that the cycle continues, and that every life, whether human or animal, carries within itself the weight of its own choices. The end that seemed like death is, in fact, the beginning of a transformation, the moment when instinct meets consciousness and fear becomes a lesson. Days before the encounter in the clearing, the savannah displayed an almost choreographed routine. The first light of dawn outlined the twisted canopies of the acacia trees, and the fresh air carried the damp scent of puddles resisting the end of the season. Herds of antelopes crossed the grass with light steps. Hyenas prowled in the distance, calculating. Flocks of birds streaked the sky, as if nothing could alter the cadence of the landscape. Against this backdrop of apparent tranquility, the lioness maintained a disciplined rhythm. Hidden in a clump of bushes, her cubs slept on their backs, trusting in the warmth of their mother's body, which, between failed hunts and vigils, still managed to provide them with food. With each dawn, she moved further away, widening the radius of her search. Her emaciated body betrayed the toll of this routine, but her gaze remained alert and tireless. During the same period, the life of the man who would become a suspended hunter followed a different logic. The camp was organized with almost mechanical precision. Canvas stretched against the wind, numbered boxes of ammunition, nets folded like sleeping snakes, maps with pen notes about trails and watering holes. All around, boot prints intersected with tire tracks, a sign of a constant and confident presence. There was a method, and this method generated a sense of control. The radio was off. The clock marked shifts, the mental spreadsheet of herd movement schedules. Everything suggested that the territory had been tamed by this discipline of capture. A false peace asserted itself in both routines. On one side, instinct honed by necessity. On the other, technique refined by habit. In the intervening years, small imbalances began to creep in, like fine fractures in thick glass. Chicks took longer to fall asleep, restless with metallic noises brought by new winds. Flocks of birds followed the same route, but broke formation at the exact point where traps had been tested. Wild boars altered their foraging schedules as if sensing changes beneath the surface. Details almost invisible to those observing from the outside, but clear to those living with their senses awake. The lioness noticed early on that her prey seemed to be fleeing an entire sector of the savannah. The trails that usually led to small watering holes showed strange markings, parallel grooves, and diagonally cut stumps of branches. Her nose registered another sign, a lingering scent of oil and metal mixed with aged rubber. She circled this area for 2 consecutive dawns, and on both occasions encountered thinner, more skittish prey, disappearing before she could even begin to approach. Her body began to take its toll. Milk became scarce, her pace became economical, and yet she persisted, returning to more dangerous territories, where human presence was growing denser. At camp, the man adjusted the next net with the patience of someone repeating a familiar ritual. The measurements followed a tried and tested logic, height sufficient to immobilize without killing. Firm knots, counterweights hidden under dry leaves. Bait hung carefully to attract curious 4-legged visitors. On the imaginary clipboard, there was a note about a solitary female sighted days earlier, followed by smaller tracks. This meant opportunity and profit. The method required the net to be invisible, and the operation silent. Every detail seemed perfect. Control once again seemed absolute. The following hours wove the trigger. A different wind blew from the south, shifting scents and confusing paths. The magnetic field of habits was discreetly rearranged. The lioness abandoned her usual route, driven by hunger and an imprecise combination of memory and intuition. At the same time, a wounded impala crossed a forbidden trail, trailing the scent of blood through bushes where nothing should attract attention. The presence of vultures, too early for that stretch, added an anomalous element that attracted the curious. And curiosity there was the first frontier of ruin. Then began the signs that would only make sense later. The sudden stillness of birds in a narrow radius. The interrupted rustling of leaves that revealed an uneven weight. The elongated shadow of a branch swaying without wind. The savannah for a moment seemed to hold its breath. The lioness, chasing the scent of the fresh wound, crossed the invisible line that marked the perimeter of the net. She paused for long seconds, weighed the atmosphere, listened to the vibration of the taut fibers. It was unusual to encounter such tense silence. She retreated a few steps, resumed a semicircle, and advanced again. Hunger pushed her body. Caution tried to hold it back. Her balance wavered. Meanwhile, the man made a round to check nearby traps. As he stepped onto a falsely firm spot, he heard the discreet click of a secondary system. It wasn't a trap, but a barely audible alarm, installed as a backup. The mental reading was immediate. Something large was circling. The sense of control, however, spoke louder than the warning. He dismissed the signal, made a mental note of the possibility of returning with more bait, and moved on to the next clearing, dragging along a slight fatigue that often precedes mistakes. The rupture didn't come with a bang, but with accumulations. A rope dampened by dew gained inappropriate elasticity. A knot tightened in haste gave way a millimeter. A counterweight displaced by a wild boar during the early morning hours altered the shooting angle. Ideally, everything would work in the hunter's favor. Under real friction, everything rearranged itself against him. When he returned to the starting point for an adjustment, he reached for the support branch and leaned his body beyond what the physics of that mechanism could tolerate. The system responded mercilessly. The ground disappeared beneath his feet. The net rose like a lung, suddenly expanding, and life hung suspended on rough fibers. At that very moment, the lioness, who had been circling the suspicious area, registered the muffled sound of the trigger. It was a noise her body recognized from inherited experience, the vibration of strings, the displacement of air, small, cascading cracks. It was no ordinary prey noise. It was the sound of a threat unleashed. The cubs, leagues away, stirred in the shadows, as if an invisible thread were pulling them into the shelter. The mother quickened her pace, driven by a mixture of caution and urgency. The false peace was shattered in less than a minute, though its ruin had been brewing for days. The man swayed. The hammock was bruised, the air was short, and dust rose to the eyes. The landscape, witness to the discipline of both worlds, now became an arena. Human method and animal instinct, which until then had walked parallels without touching, finally collided. The lioness would emerge from the grass shortly after. The hunter, deprived of his certainties, would begin to measure time in the beats of his own heart. There would still be resistance. Amidst the pain and panic, the man would try to reaffirm the narrative of control, calculating exits, reviewing procedures, mentally checking knots and balances. He would deny for a moment the absolute fragility of the situation, as if willpower could remake the architecture of the ropes. On the other side, the lioness would also resist an impulse older than memory, calibrating each step with the memory of her cubs and the millimeter mapping of the danger. Two types of denial, two masks erected before the same abyss. At the end of that day that began routinely and ended in disarray, the board was set. The accumulation of signs had become concrete evidence. The taut net, the suspended body, the scent of fear streaking the wind. Everything that had presented itself as normal had revealed its fragility. The savannah now hinted that the cycle of cause and effect would demand explanations. Within the contours of this new order, the unanswered question brought extremes closer together. What force would define the next movement? Hunger, fear, or something beyond the usual names? The sun had already broken through the thin morning mist when the hunter regained consciousness. His body throbbed under the weight of the taut ropes, and the net swayed in the wind. The heat made sweat run down his eyes, mixing with the dust that clung to his skin. Time, suspended there, seemed to move in slow circles, measured by the rhythm of his own desperation. Each attempt to free himself only tightened the grip, and the pain spread in silent waves. The clearing that had once seemed like just another hunting scene now enveloped him like a living prison. Hours piled up. The sounds of the forest grew louder, the rustling of insects, the insistent buzzing of flies, the snapping of branches beneath invisible paws. The man's mind tried to rationalize the unacceptable. It was merely a technical error, an accident, a fixable, unforeseen event. He would only have to wait. Someone would find him. But the more time passed, the more the silence responded with indifference. The forest rescued no one. Hunger and thirst began to erode his lucidity. His blurred vision mixed light and shadow, transforming his field of vision into a mirage. It was on this threshold between delirium and instinct that he noticed movement on the horizon, something approaching, unhurriedly, gauging the distance. Its scent was precise, its gait calculated. The golden muscular form advanced through the tall grass, the lioness. His heart raced in an animal rhythm, as if trying to flee before his body could obey. The lioness circled him in silence. Her golden eyes reflected the sun's glare, but there was something there that defied pure instinct. She watched him with an almost ritualistic calm, as if she recognized him. The human scent was familiar, the same that had accompanied the deaths of mates and cubs, the same odor that marked territory ravaged by traps. But in that suspended, motionless figure, something was out of the natural order. The threat was gone. Only weakness remained. She circled, sniffing the ground, studying the structure of the net. A light touch of her claws made the ropes vibrate, sending a wave of instinctive dread through the man. He held his breath, waiting for the attack that never came. The lioness retreated a few steps and lay down, keeping her gaze fixed on him. The savannah's most feared predator, now quiet, watched its prey without intent to kill. It was as if the cycle had reversed, and the beast was evaluating the meaning of this. The sun rose high, and the heat punished them both. Flies circled the wound on the man's arm, and the metallic smell permeated the air. The lioness rose and instinctively advanced to a small puddle nearby, drinking slowly. Then she lay down again. Time passed illogically. The man tried to understand why he was still alive. His mind searched for human explanations, chance, miracle, luck, but none of them fit the scene he was witnessing. Far away, environmental surveillance teams flew over the region, searching for signs of illegal hunting. Thermal imaging cameras captured a silhouette trapped in a net, but what caught the operator's attention was the motionless presence of a large feline just a few meters away. The contrast was so improbable that it caused confusion on the monitors. The enlarged image showed the impossible: a wounded hunter, a lioness lying nearby, and between them, a piece that defied the rules of survival. The helicopter circled overhead, the sound of its blades echoing like thunder. The lioness raised her head, looked skyward, and remained motionless. The exhausted man noticed that the beast reacted not with fear, but with a kind of silent, almost resigned dignity. It was as if she understood that the noise came from a world to which she did not belong, the same world that was destroying her territory, but now watched her in reverence. As the officers descended, the lioness retreated slowly, without roaring, only with firm steps. The man, delirious, watched the golden body disappear into the vegetation, as if nature itself had reclaimed it. The rescuer's hands cut the ropes, freeing him from the net, but not from the guilt. His physical wounds were minor compared to what was taking hold in his mind, the awareness of inversion. In the camp's makeshift hospital, the account of what had happened sounded absurd. No one believed it. They said the sun had made him delirious, that hunger and fear had distorted his memory. But the air team had the footage, the few seconds of video showing the lioness beside the man. Even so, most chose to ignore it. It was easier to deny the impossible than to accept that the instincts of a starving beast had been more compassionate than those of many humans. The hunter, now isolated and discredited, relived the moment over and over. The sound of the wind, the animal's gaze, the restrained gesture. Each memory gnawed at him. The beast had spared him, and that condemned him. He realized with growing discomfort that the world he believed he dominated had shown him its own reflection. Fragile, contradictory, small. In the days that followed, he tried to return to his routine, but the sound of the net snapping haunted his dreams. His hands trembled at the touch of a knot, and his heart raced at the mere distant roar. Something had broken irreversibly. The power that once translated into dominance was now synonymous with guilt. The savannah continued its course, indifferent, but for him, time had split in two, before and after the lioness's gaze. No technical argument, no mental denial could erase the feeling of having been forgiven for what I feared most. And it is at this threshold between proof and denial that the next cycle begins, the moment when man, forced to face his own humanity, will become the object of a truth he can no longer deny. The following days transformed the silent clearing into a stage of commotion. The footage taken by the aerial crew circulated among journalists, environmentalists, and authorities. The video, just a few seconds long, showed the unthinkable: a hungry lioness standing next to a restrained hunter, observing him without attacking. The press hailed it as the miracle of the savannah, and public opinion was divided between skepticism and reverence. Meanwhile, the man, now in custody, faced interrogations about his illegal activities. His body was still recovering, but his mind remained at war, between shame and obsession with the gaze of the animal that had spared him. Environmental authorities sent a team to investigate the site. Technicians, biologists, and trackers scoured the area marked by the incident. They found remnants of traps, overlapping footprints, and evidence of ancient hunts. The scattered nets, ropes, and hooks told a story of abuse and destruction. However, among the dry marks in the earth, there were also fresh traces, small, round impressions arranged in circles. These were the footprints of cubs. The lioness who had saved the man was not alone. She had a litter under her care, and this made her behavior even more enigmatic. The team's lead biologist noticed something peculiar. The female's tracks didn't indicate a disorderly escape, but rather controlled movements, as if she were monitoring the perimeter and cyclically returning to the same spot. This pattern suggested a different kind of territorial awareness, an attempt to protect the space, not just hunt. The fact was noted and added to the report as a rare behavioral hypothesis. Scientific investigation was beginning to transform the event into a subject of global study. Meanwhile, the hunter remained in preventive isolation, awaiting trial. However, something within him was already stirring. At night, dreams took him back to the savannah. He found himself suspended in the hammock again, feeling the lioness's gaze penetrate his soul. He woke sweating, with a racing heart and a new uncomfortable feeling: regret. The beast that had spared him had become the mirror of his own lost humanity. He began to write notes, incoherent scribbles, trying to capture what he had felt. They were fragments of memory that sounded more confessional than rational. When the rescue team returned to try to locate the lioness, the man insisted on accompanying them. The authorities hesitated, but scientific curiosity overcame protocol. Wearing borrowed clothes and a distant look in his eye, he walked through the dry bushes, guided by memories only he seemed to understand. As he reached the clearing, the wind blew in swirls, and the smell of rain about to fall made him relive the moment when everything had stopped in time. Drones hovered overhead, and within minutes, thermal images emerged. There was movement on the northern slope, 3 small silhouettes and 1 larger one, the lioness and her cubs. The team approached cautiously. The man moved, recognized the animal's posture, lying down, observing from afar without aggression. Instinctively, he took a step forward, ignoring the guard's orders. The lioness raised her head and kept her gaze fixed on him, as if knowing this reunion was inevitable. But nature rarely grants second miracles. A gunshot shattered the silence. The blast echoed across the savannah and startled everyone. The lioness leapt to her feet, roaring in despair. The bullet hadn't hit her, but the sound was enough to unleash chaos. The cubs ran, the drones lost focus, and dust covered the horizon. The source of the shot was traced. A second group of armed men, local hunters, were trying to take advantage of the commotion to capture the legendary animal that had gained worldwide fame. The revelation fell like a blade. Among the investigators was an informant linked to the illegal trade. The protection mission had turned into an ambush. The lioness, frightened, disappeared into the forest with her cubs. The man, stunned, screamed, trying to stop them from shooting again, but was restrained by the guards. The criminal group escaped before the helicopter could intercept them. The betrayal had been consummated, and the chaos had left irreversible scars. In the following days, distorted reports dominated the news. Some channels claimed the lioness had been killed, others that she had attacked the group of biologists. Neither version was confirmed. The authorities remained silent, and the public fed theories. The man, now admitted to a clinic under surveillance, was seen as a symbolic figure, the hunter forgiven by his own victim, the survivor of a natural judgment. But he knew the story wasn't over. One morning, unable to bear the guilt and doubt, he fled the clinic. He carried only a flashlight and a notebook where he had written a single purpose: to find the lioness before the world destroyed her. The savannah, slumbering under the moonlight, seemed to call him back to the beginning. With each step, the sound of the leaves resembled the snap of the net. Past and present blended. He was no longer hunter or prey, he was witness. From above, the night sky opened up into constellations that seemed to watch him silently. Somewhere in the distance, a roar echoed, not a threat but a warning. The man smiled for the first time since the accident, understanding that there was still something alive, wild, and incorruptible beyond human guilt. Dawn was fading into grey when the man rediscovered the clearing. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of rain and damp leaves. Each step sank him deeper into the mud, and the night chill cut into his bones. He walked unhurriedly, guided only by the memory of that gaze, the same one that had saved him days ago. Time seemed to circle, as if nature were forcing him to relive the moment that had changed everything. But now there was no net, no cameras, no human voices. Only the wind, the insects, and the certainty that the outcome awaited him. The sky began to lighten, turning a pale orange. Near the edge of the valley, the man saw what he was looking for: small, fresh footprints in the mud. They led to a stand of ancient, gnarled trees, where the ground sank into pools of water. He stopped, took a deep breath, and realized he was not alone. The lioness emerged from the shadows with the same imposing presence as before, her muscles tense, her gaze steady and silent. The cubs sheltered behind her, curious and wary. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Man and beast, face to face, without barriers. The rain began to fall in large drops, marking the ground between them, as if marking an invisible boundary. The man dropped the lantern and knelt exhausted. There was no more fear, only surrender. The lioness, motionless, watched every gesture with almost human attention. Time lost its shape. The wind blew through the trees, and the distant roar of thunder resembled an ancient chant. It was then that the sound of engines erupted in the distance. Sirens and lights cut through the morning mist. Police cars approached, followed by drones and reporters. The human spectacle returned to the scene that nature had kept secret. The man slowly stood up, his eyes brimming with tears, and raised his hands, asking for silence. The cameras framed him as the lioness stood firm, her body tense, her cubs nestled under her belly. The agents surrounded the perimeter, ready to act. The order was to capture the animal and take it to the sanctuary. But at that moment the man placed himself between them. The gesture was instinctive, desperate, born of the understanding that the being was not a threat, but a witness. The scene became a pure climax, nature and man in direct confrontation before the world. The silence was broken only by the lioness's deep roar, a sound that seemed to carry centuries of history compressed into a single cry. The cameras captured everything. The roar, the gesture, the rain falling on both of them. No attack occurred. Just an exchange of glances that seemed to cross species and meanings. The drones hovered above the scene like divine eyes, recording the moment when predator and hunter became equals, survivors of the same defensive instinct. The agents, confused, hesitated. The chief biologist lowered his radio and, for the first time, disobeyed the order. He said only one simple, barely audible phrase, "Let nature decide." The tension slowly dissolved. The lioness, sensing the danger receding, turned toward the horizon and began walking. The cubs followed her, leaving footprints that would soon be erased by the rain. The man remained motionless, watching until the last moment when the golden color was lost in the mist. The sirens ceased. The helicopter hovered for a few seconds and then moved away, taking the crowd with it. The clearing returned to silence. The man stood there, alone in the rain, feeling the light weight of something impossible to name. He wept, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The lioness had not only spared him, she had given him back something he had never truly possessed: respect for life. In the following days, the images circulated around the world. The story made headlines, sparked studies and debates. Experts spoke of animal behavior, instinctive empathy, and evolutionary reciprocity. But nothing they said captured the essence of what happened. The video didn't show a miracle or an exception. It showed a reflection. A human being seeing itself for the first time through the eyes of the one it called a beast. Justice took its course. The hunter was convicted of environmental crimes, but due to his cooperation and remorse, his sentence was commuted to conservation service. He worked side by side with the same biologists who had previously investigated him, patrolling areas where traps still killed in silence. Each morning, he looked to the horizon with the same sense of debt and promise. Months later, a new video went viral. Recorded by surveillance drones, it showed a lioness and 3 cubs walking safely far from hunting grounds. One of the cubs, curious, looked up at the sky and roared at the camera as if responding to a distant call. The man watched the footage in silence, and a small smile formed. There was no longer fear or guilt, just the recognition that life, in its mysterious logic, always gives back what we sow. In the final scene, the sun sets over the savannah, gilding the rain-soaked grass. The man, standing atop a hill, gazes at the horizon, the wind whipping the dust into gentle swirls. He closes his eyes, takes a deep breath, and listens to the distant sound of a roar. There is no more hunting, no more escape, only coexistence. The story ends where it began, on the same land under the same sky, but now purified. The final sentence echoes as a lesson and an epitaph. Nature holds no grudge. She only gives back what the heart offers.